When it's time to get serious in your garden, it is time for STIHL, Australia's #1 brand for garden power tools. I'll be telling you about STIHL's great range of battery-powered outdoor equipment a little later in the podcast. But for now, let me just say they're powerful, they're lightweight, quiet, and they give you the power and performance you need to take care of some serious work in your garden. Check out the full range and find your nearest dealer now at stihl.com.au.
A listener production.
As an avid lover of nature, I'm always eager to learn more about how I can make my backyard more sustainable and give back to the environment. And nothing so sustainable like healthy compost. But if you're new to the game, knowing how to tame your worms and make your compost thrive can be a big job.
There aren't that many things that I say no to in terms of feeding to your worm.
Hi, I'm Charlie Albone, and in partnership with STIHL, on this episode of That's How We Grow, I'm catching up with Hannah Churton, or as she's known by composting enthusiasts, the wormmonger.
You just have to be careful about the amount and make sure that you're giving your worms a varied diet and remembering everything in moderation, and everything will be fine.
Hannah is a composting and climate change advocate who has formed an equally passionate community, providing her expertise nationwide through educational services and social media. Hannah, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I guess I'm the wormmonger and I'm a really avid worm farmer. The big thing about me, I run a community composting hub out of my backyard, and I basically compost everyone's food scraps on my street and now branching out into the broader community. And that has since turned into a beautiful community verge garden and a food swap in my suburb.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how did this all start?
Interestingly, it wasn't my job that got me into it. Well, it was way more of a side passion and something aside from my job that gave me, I guess, a little bit of a release from the stress of work.
Right.
So I previously professionally travelled a lot for work and lived in other countries, and something that gave me a real sense of home when I got to these new environments was starting a garden and starting my compost hub. You know, I was literally putting down roots.
Yes.
And eventually I decided to start to document that journey. And it was very much something that gave me joy outside of work, which drove it really. And then, of course, it just morphed into its own beast. It became its own thing.
Its own wormy beast.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's the day-to-day look like for this community hub?
Well, people bring me their food scraps. So I make it as simple as possible for the community. So one of the big things that I was really conscious of when I started this was that as soon as people start to get intimidated by the process, they'll just shut down and they won't participate. So I made it as simple as possible. I really drove into KISS principles, keep it simple, stupid.
Yep.
So all people have to do is to bring along their bucket to my carport, dump it in my drop-off bin, which is, you know, a big black garbage bin, and then go home. That's all they have to do. And from there, I process those scraps through a whole series of bathtub worm farms,
right,
which I keep under my house. And that, of course, turns into this beautiful end product, the worm castings, which then go into the community garden out the front of my house. And then it's just this beautiful demonstration of circularity. So people eating their food, processing that waste into compost, and then it's going into the garden to produce the food that community is then eating.
Right. So where did the love of the sustainability come from? Was it from the traveling and putting down a garden and wanting to do the same when you just moved in, or?
I've always been really interested in reducing food waste to landfill. And so I think in that sense, it was a little bit arse about. I think most people kind of come into it and they're growing a garden, and so they're driven by trying to improve the quality of their soil.
Yep.
I actually came to it from quite a different perspective and eventually got to that point of, you know, having my own garden and growing my own produce. But initially it started as this real desire to keeping food scraps out of landfill and the environmental impacts of that footprint on the planet.
Yeah, that is, as you eloquently put, arse about.
It is.
But I like it. So do you compost as well? Do you have compost heap? Are you strictly a worm lady?
I live in the suburbs, so I'm limited by space, and that kind of drives the way that I compost. So I've got my worm farms. I've got about 8 bathtubs under my house, which that pretty much processes most of the food scraps that come from the community. But I also have some of those black Dalek style worm bins.
Yes.
Sorry, not worm bins, compost bins. Yeah, and that's just a conventional style of cold composting that I have dotted around my garden as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Geez, the soil at your place must be pretty good.
Starting slowly to get there.
Yeah. So tell me the process with the worm farms and the bathtub, because most people would know the small black worm farms that you buy. You know, you make a little bed for the worm farm, you put your stuff on top and the worms come in and out. How does the bathtub work?
It's exactly the same. So bathtubs actually are the perfect design for worm farms because they have natural drainage through the plug hole. And also, if you look at a bathtub, they're just on a slight slope. They've got water drains into the plug. They're always on a slight kind of decline. So everything drains down into that plug. And that is perfect for worm farm drainage. The other great thing about bathtubs is that they're free. And so it's a really cheap way to upcycle rather than sending those items to landfill.
Does the bathtub have to be complete, as in no cracks or anything like that? Or if they've been damaged, can you still use them?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I've actually got one that's kind of a spa style, so it's got holes in it and it still works. If it had giant holes in the bottom, you probably wouldn't be able to use it. But otherwise, they're pretty good to go. They're pretty robust.
Right.
What I do like to use is fiberglass ones because I can manually shift those. As someone who's relatively small of stature, I can still maneuver those myself.
Yes.
I can rock up to, a renovation site and drag the tub into the back of my car on my own, and I don't have to rely on manpower to do that. So the big older style, heavier
clawfoot ones.
Clawfoot, yeah, you wouldn't want to go there because it just, it takes several men to carry those.
Yeah. What height do you have to have them? Because I could imagine if you're collecting what comes out of the plug hole, that needs to be at least the height of a watering can. Is that right?
You really only need to probably have it about 10 centimetres off the ground. And to collect the wee, as they call it. I actually don't typically use the wee. I'm more interested in the poo.
Yeah.
But it's draining into soil. You could just leave it, or you could take away that wee and water it down and put it on your ornamental garden.
Yeah.
And that works a treat as well. But you really only need it to have as high off the ground as any kind of vessel could fit under there to collect that runoff.
Right. Yeah, because the runoff isn't actually wee, is it? It's just the moisture that comes out of the food that's draining through.
Yeah, that's right. So that's actually a little bit of a myth. They call it the wee, but it hasn't actually been processed through the worm.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a controversial one, the wee, as to how you use it. And that's just because it's not a particularly stable product because you don't know whether it has been processed through the worm. And so in that sense, it's a leachate that contains unknowns basically. And so you don't actually know what's going on your garden, and there could be nasties in there or things that aren't particularly beneficial to your garden as such.
Yeah, I mean, I use the wee, let's call it, out of my worm farm, but I always dilute it and make sure I kind of spread it around. I don't tend to use it on veggies and things like that, just, in other spots around the garden.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to use it. That's how I use it too. Right. And I just water it right down to kind of a really pale tea kind of colour.
Yeah.
And then put it on mostly my ornamentals.
So when you're setting up a worm farm, what are the ingredients you need? How do you do it? Because like I said, the black ones that you get from the hardware store, they come with a bedding, let's call it. So how do you do that on a large scale, like a bathtub?
It's pretty similar actually. So you still need the bedding, and that can be all sorts of carbon matter that you find around the house. Leaf litter, dried leaf litter is the best. I live in the suburbs, so I tend not to have a great deal of dried leaf litter at the ready. And that's okay. That's okay. Lots of people have worm farms in urbanised environments. And so I also like to talk about the things from around the house that you can use that are great beddings. And that's things like scrunched newspaper or shredded paper or toilet rolls.
Yep.
Or paper towel, or egg cartons are really great as well. Carbon material will create the initial bedding for the worms, and then you throw your worms in and start feeding them the food scraps, which is the nitrogen component to the worm farm.
Yep.
And then, like a conventional composting system, you continue to add the carbon and the nitrogen matter to that farm to keep a bit of a balance. And then the worms supercharge that process and eat the scraps, all of the carbon and the nitrogen, and poo out this beautiful end product.
Right, so you don't use something that retains a lot of moisture like a cocoa fibre, because that's often what you find in the worm farms off the shelf.
Yeah, I do use that if I have it to hand. I always like to recommend people use what they have to hand first rather than buying something off the shelf.
Yeah.
And because there's so much material, carbon material readily available in households, you don't have to go down that route buying for an initial setup. It's not necessary.
Okay.
And if you don't have to, don't do it.
Yeah, and if you're using leaf litter, do you need to shred that or just chuck it in there?
You can just chuck it in or shred it. Either way, I'm a bit of a lazy composter. and a lot of people are time poor. And so you do what you can with the time that you've got. Leaf litter, it will eventually be broken down. If you don't shred it, it'll take a little bit longer to break down, but eventually it will break down.
Mm-hmm.
And it has this beautiful structural integrity, which is why it's such an amazing carbon addition to a worm farm, that it will retain moisture and break down slowly. And actually, that's a great thing.
Right. Eucalypt leaves okay? And is there any leaves you can't use?
There are some leaves that you just need to go through a couple of additional processes. Eucalyptus is one of those, just because of the content of that material and also the time that it takes to actually dry out. So a lot of leaves will retain nitrogen content for a lot longer than others. And what you want is something really, really dry to make up that carbon component of your worm farm.
Yeah, because it is going to get wet again. So the drying just removes the nitrogen rather than, well, it removes the moisture, but you're removing the nitrogen when you remove the moisture.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, great.
So when it looks really brown and it's really crispy, all of the nitrogen has been removed from that and you've got a great carbon matter, and that's what you're looking for.
Right, so for a standard bathtub, how much bedding are you trying to put in?
Probably just about a 5 centimetre layer.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I will put in scrunched newspaper, and already kind of one layer of scrunched newspaper, and you've got your 5 centimetres.
Yeah.
And that's also, the scrunching of the newspaper allows lots of airflow through there as well. So you're getting aeration through the farm.
Right.
And that's plenty. Across a bathtub, that's actually quite a bit of carbon matter.
Yes.
So once you've got about 5 centimetres or so, you can throw your worms in.
And how many worms do you need for a standard bathtub?
Well, worms populate really quickly. So I would just put in a regular amount of worms. By regular amount, you can kind of buy them by the 1,000, and then they'll just populate. They kind of double in size every 60 days or so. And that's the way I would do it in order to save money, because if you're buying worms commercially, it's actually quite expensive, and those worms will actually populate over time to fill the vessel that they're in.
Okay.
And so rather than an initial outlay that's a lot of money, you could just wait. And that process will then affect how much food you can feed your worm farm in the interim, because you won't have as many worms in there. But it's a cheaper way to do it.
Can you take some worms from another worm farm? Like take the bedding out of one and put it into another to start it?
Yes, I do that all the time.
Yeah.
That's how I create a new bathtub, just using kind of half the contents of another bathtub of mine. And then slowly that population will increase to fill the vessel that it's in.
So again, use what you've got rather than go and buy it if you don't have to.
Yeah, I'm constantly kind of rolling that line out. But, you know, I do think we can use the resources that are to hand, and that's a much more sustainable way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't go and dig a hole in the garden and use earthworms. They've got to be composting worms.
They do have to be composting worms. Yeah. Lots of people ask me that question, but they're actually quite different beasts.
Yes.
So composting worms are surface dwellers, and they rely on decaying matter to survive, whereas earthworms will dive deep, deep, deep down into the soil, and they're just not going to do the same job that a composting worm does with your food scraps. They're not interested.
Yes. So when it comes to the food, what sort of a mix do worms like? What's the ideal diet for a composting worm?
Well, they like a really varied diet, so they're just like humans in that sense. And then I say go for gold. There aren't that many things that I say no to in terms of feeding to your worms.
Okay.
And if you live in my household, you know, my worms are getting all sorts of things because I have small children, and so they're getting the leftovers from dinner, so cooked food scraps. They're getting little bits and pieces of meat, uncooked meat and dairy. They're getting everything. Everything that my household doesn't eat goes into the worm farm.
Including onions?
Including onions, yeah.
Even garlic and citrus? Because I know citrus can be a bit of an issue for a worm, can't they?
It can be, but my mantra is everything in moderation.
Yep.
And small amounts of lemon, small amounts of onion, small amounts of garlic, things that have that acidic component that can be slightly off-putting for the worms. Lemons also have a chemical component that worms don't particularly like in large amounts, but they will absorb it in small amounts, and that's okay. I'm running bathtub farms, so my system can absorb a lot. But even if you're running an urban unit, you can put small amounts of citrus and onion in there and your worms will process that. You just have to be careful about the amount and make sure that you're giving your worms a varied diet and remembering everything in moderation, and everything will be fine.
Right, okay. With the worms, they don't have big noshy teeth to bite through stuff. Do you tend to cut your scraps down into smaller bits, or do you just chuck it all in?
It's a great idea to cut it down. Again, I'm a lazy composter and I'm really time poor. So most of the time I'm not doing that. The reality is I just don't have the time to do that in my household. And also with my community compost hub, I'm just getting huge amounts of food scraps through that system that I don't have enough time to cut it up. And that's totally fine. If it's adding something to the process that is beyond your capacity as a worm farmer, don't do it. The worms will still process that food. It'll just take them a little bit longer.
Right. Yeah, like I said, they don't have teeth, so they don't bite the food. They just suck the decaying stuff on the outside. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. They've got a gizzard, so they'll process that food through a gizzard. And in that sense, they're a little bit reliant on a grit through the system as well. So anything gritty that you add will also be helpful for the farm. But yeah, they're not eating it in the same way that we do with teeth and chewing and breaking that food down in the same way that a human does.
When you say grit, what could you use? Do you need to use a sand, or will something like an eggshell work?
Eggshells are perfect because, that's also reducing your food waste in your household. In order to make that a grit, you do actually have to cut it up or grind it into a gritty kind of composition. And so that is an additional amount of work that you've got to do.
Yeah.
Sand, I don't actually often add grit to my worm farms because there's enough that's going through the system that is naturally gritty that will do the trick in terms of the gizzard for the worm. And so I think, again, if you're time poor and a lazy composter, that's not something that I would add to my worm farming activities if it took you over the edge in terms of your capacity.
Yeah, but I find once you start, you want to do more and more. So with eggshells, I leave them outside to dry out before I grind them up because I made the mistake of trying to grind up fresh ones that were all gunky. And the more you get into it, the more you want to do for them. They do become like pets, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. All of mine could probably be named at this point.
So you got 6 bathtubs, you buy them by the 1,000 and you've got names for all of them.
Yeah, they really are my babies, that's for sure. But you're right, once you get into the practice of doing it, you do want to do more and you are way more invested in the health of your farm and what's going into that farm because, the healthier that farm becomes, the healthier the end product is, and it's an addictive activity. Absolutely it is.
It's time to take a quick break from That's How We Grow to talk about the team that powers this podcast, STIHL. When the weather warms up, there's nothing better than getting busy out in the garden, especially when you're loaded up with all the best equipment to get the job done. Of course, I'm talking about STIHL battery-powered outdoor equipment. Check it out at stihl.com.au now and see the great range. It's powerful, lightweight, quiet, and gives you the power and performance you need to take care of some serious work in your garden. Pruners and trimmers, mowers and chainsaws, saws, blowers, vacs, and heaps more. The range is absolutely enormous. But you know what's even bigger? The choice of STIHL dealers right around the country. There's over 600 in fact, so there's one near you. Get out there, enjoy the sunshine, and get busy in the garden with STIHL battery-powered outdoor equipment. The #1 brand for garden power tools in Australia and the #1 selling brand of chainsaws worldwide. Check out the full range and find your nearest dealer now at stihl.com.au. That's stihl.com.au. Right, let's get back to the podcast. So you mentioned that you put everything in, including meat. So how do you keep vermin out of 6 bathtubs under a house?
They're all contained, so they've all got lids. I just put on top of each of my bathtubs marine ply, and I think it's a 3 mil marine ply that I bought from Bunnings. You can also put things like old doors if you want to upcycle, which I'm always about. Old doors fit perfectly over a bathtub. Just something that contains the system and you won't have a vermin problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But you also need something that's light enough to be able to lift off to, I guess, distribute the food evenly. Is that what you do, or do you just chuck it through a hole and hope for the best?
No, I distribute it evenly. So I'll take those lids off each time, and each time I feed my farm, I'm also aerating the farm. So I'm digging the food in just a little bit.
Right.
And that stops other critters from getting in there. So even though you've got your marine ply on top of your bathtub, say, flies can still get in, cockroaches can still get in. It's a real ecosystem. So you do find that you've got other critters in there. Sometimes they're unwanted critters, and digging your food scraps in will stop unwanted critters from accessing that farm.
Yeah, because I've noticed with mine those tiny little flies that are almost like dust. How do you deal with those?
They're the biggest problem that I've got. I live in the subtropics, and those flies are just the worst.
Yeah.
They're quite difficult to get rid of, but the thing is they're attracted to the smell of foods because food is an ideal place for them to lay their eggs, and they're attracted to the smell of the decaying food, basically. Yeah. So masking that smell is the best way to minimize them. And again, that's digging your food scraps in.
Okay.
Probably having a worm blanket, which can be anything from an old towel or an old blanket, anything that's made of natural fibre can kind of go on top of your worm farm. You can also buy Hessian and commercially available worm blankets.
Yeah. Would folded newspaper work?
Yeah, folded newspaper will work. It will break down fairly quickly, so you just need to replace that.
Yeah.
I use newspaper all the time. Pizza boxes is another really good one.
Okay.
Old pizza boxes. That creates a barrier between the outside world and your worm farm, an additional barrier which will mask smells.
Okay. And how much water do you have to add to a worm farm?
I don't add much at all because food scraps are typically very high in moisture. Mm-hmm. And so I try not to add anything more than what those food scraps are already adding to the farm. What you want in your farm is a moisture level that is the consistency of a dried out sponge. So, if you picked up a handful of your worm farm, if a few drops of water dropped out, that's perfect. If you've got a running waterfall kind of dripping down your arm, probably a little bit too much moisture. So you can start to gauge how much moisture your farm needs and how much moisture is in your farm by look and touch. And then if it's really drying out, then you could add a little bit of water. I think normally it's actually the opposite problem. You've got too much moisture because you're not adding enough carbon to your farm to suck up the moisture content of your food scraps.
Right. So like a traditional worm farm, I guess traditional is the right word, but say a store-bought one, you have the bedding on one level and the scraps on a second level. But you're suggesting that you keep adding carbon and scraps and just keep building it up and up?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can do it one of two ways. You can do it that way. So a lot of my bathtub farms are just a rolling system, which I don't leave to rest until they're very full. And then I'll leave them for 3 months just to sit and process.
Okay.
Or you can do it another way whereby you kind of fill them up quite quickly and then move on to another tray and leave that tray to rest. So if you're talking about the little urban farms, you can fill them on a rolling basis. Or if you actually want to use the processed casting, leave it to the side to process. In 3 months' time, you'll have that ready to go and you can pop it straight out onto your garden.
So where's the ideal location for a worm farm? Is it under a house?
It's in the most protected part of your house. So in the shade, out of the elements, so out of the sun. I live in the subtropics, so for me, the heat is the biggest problem. So I'm looking for a place that's the coolest part of my backyard, that doesn't get a lot of sun, that's protected from the wind, that's also protected from the rain. But if you live in a cold climate, you might actually be looking for a slightly warmer place or something that's out of the rain mostly, if you get a lot of rain where you are. So it's just the most protected place from the elements, whatever those elements are, wherever you live.
Right. Can you have a worm farm in an area that gets frost, or you just need to really protect it with a lot of blanket?
Yeah, worm farms, ideally, they'll live in conditions ranging from about 12 to 28 degrees Celsius, I would say. And so anything below that, and you'll start to see the population dying off. Likewise, anything above 28 degrees, and you'll start to see the population dying off. So for me in summer, I always see a slight decline in my worm populations because I'm frequently getting temperatures over 28 degrees. Other parts of Australia, it's the cold that you're worried about. You will always find a little bit of a decline in population, but you can do things to mitigate real loss. So keeping the farm warm in cold conditions. And by that, what you can do is lift the farm off the ground, and little urban units that you can buy commercially are already lifted off the ground. So that's great. But you can also cover them. So you can cover them on the inside with a blanket, which is what I was talking about earlier. And that keeps some of the warmth in. And then you can also actually cover the exterior with an old blanket or towel or a tarp or something that keeps the temperature in a little bit. Again, keeping it out of the wind or the element, or keeping it on a side of your house which doesn't actually get all of those conditions is the best. You can also keep worm farms inside, which will keep them warm. So that's also a great option.
They wouldn't get too smelly inside?
Well, ideally your worm farm doesn't smell at all. So if you've got a healthy farm, you won't notice that smell at all.
Okay.
But garages are really great for worm farms if you're worried about things like smells, laundries, bathrooms. I was living in the tropics at one stage, and I was keeping a small urban worm farm in a wardrobe because that was the coolest part of the house. And it was fine. It didn't smell. It was a healthy little farm, and it just kind of bubbled along with some suits and stuff.
Okay. I've never heard of a wardrobe worm farm before, so you really do take the wormmonger name to the limit. So that's setting them up and looking after them. What can you do with the wonderful castings that the worms make, and how do you harvest them?
Yeah, the castings really are the black gold of the worm farming process. So great thing about those is that you can use them immediately. Unlike other compost, you don't need to mature it. There's no process of maturing it. You can just dump that stuff straight onto your yard, and it's this beautiful pH neutral, nutrient-rich compost that just goes directly onto your garden. It's full of potassium and phosphorus and nitrogen and all sorts of microorganisms that just work wonders on your garden. And it's a really great organic alternative to kind of commercially bought composts and fertilizers and that kind of thing. So it's wonderful for your garden. How you harvest that depends on the system that you've got. If you've got a little urban unit, like the ones that you buy commercially, then what I suggest is that in the towers that you build, that one of those trays in the towers, you set aside for 8 weeks or so, and then that will be ready to go because it'll just process down over 8 weeks. You're not adding anything additional to it. So all the worms will be doing is pooing out the end product, and then you can just take that whole thing and dump it on your garden. And the worms will move down the system. Wherever the food scraps are available, they'll work their way down wherever that source of food is. So you don't even really have to manually remove or separate the worms from the end product.
They just do it themselves.
They just do it themselves. So that's the easiest way to do it.
And do you need to dilute the contents?
No, not at all. It is perfect to use as is. It's pH neutral, and yeah, it's a beautiful product to dump straight onto your garden.
Is it good to dilute it though? So a normal worm tray that isn't in a bathtub is quite small compared to the average size garden. So that microorganism content is fantastic. And can you spread that around so it goes further?
Yeah, I probably would, depending on how much garden you've got, I guess. But you don't have to.
So you just dig it straight in, maybe add it to a potting mix, something like that?
I do both, actually. So I'll often, depending on how much time I've got, I'll dump it straight on my garden just as is. And other times, if I've got a bit more of a planned process going with my garden, or it's the beginning of a planting season or something, I'll go to much more effort and add it into a bigger pile of other compost or fertilizer or lasagna gardening kind of process that I'm creating, and then work that into the mix in a bit more of a diluted way, as you say.
Okay. And you mentioned compost there, and you've got some Dalek bins. How do you find the difference between composting and worm farms? Which do you prefer?
Well, such a huge advocate of the worms now. And that's just a product of habit, I think. And the fact that I'm so used to them and I understand their behaviours and the way that they work so well, that for me, that process works the best.
Right.
I feel like there's slightly more involved with the Daleks in that I do aerate them. And so I'll take time to actually aerate them with an aerating screw.
You could try a static lung in your Dalek.
Absolutely, it could. Yeah.
So you take a pipe and drill lots of holes through it, have it in the center of the Dalek. Then you don't have to screw as much. That kind of draws the air through.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, no, my Dalek systems aren't particularly sophisticated.
Do you enjoy composting as well as worm farms, or you just prefer the worm farms?
I enjoy them both, yeah. And, there's a place for each. So my Dalek bins are placed around my garden in places where intermittently I want to put a big pile of compost. And so I'll fill those Dalek bins up and wait for it to process down. And then it's already in situ. So I don't really have to move the compost around. I just lift the Dalek up and disperse the compost around and it's good to go. And that minimizes effort on my behalf.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it, actually, because then you're not, having to put it in a wheelbarrow and push it around.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What would you like people to be doing in their own home gardens? Because you're obviously an advocate for this. You're trying to inspire people. Like, what's the dream?
I think the dream is that we are all reducing food waste to landfill, firstly. Mm-hmm. And that means that in all of our households, we are being really, really conscious of the food that is going into our bins, and that we're being responsible in the way that we're managing that waste. So we're either eating it, which is ideally what we would be doing is we'd be eating it, and when we can't eat it, then we're composting it.
I think part of that process is trying to grow your own as well, because I think as soon as you start growing your own, you realize how difficult it is to do that, and then you really appreciate the food that you do have. You tend to throw out a lot less. You try and eat as much as you possibly can, and that really closes the circle.
There's absolutely no doubt about that. I feel like once I started to grow my own food, I had so much more respect for the food that I was eating. And that was the food that I was growing firstly. But there's a real snowball effect there in that, you start to think about seasonality, for example, and you start to think about the food that we're buying commercially and where that food came from and who's growing that food and how far it's traveled to get to you. You start to think of all of these things in a real knock-on effect, and you just have so much more respect for the food that you eat and the value that you attach to that food. It makes a huge difference once you actually start to grow it.
Absolutely. And I think when you start to grow food yourself, you look at it and you realize that what you're growing doesn't look like what comes in the supermarket, and how have they made it look like that, and what have they used, and do I really want to be eating that, or can I be taking these scraps, putting them in a worm farm, feeding my plants with that and making them healthier that way?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much in that because, it takes a lot to grow something. I am still endlessly proud of anything that I can harvest from my own garden. And so, it doesn't matter how ugly that piece of food is. Yeah. I'll be eating it. I can assure you.
Absolutely. I'm the same thing. I just like to take pictures of it and show my kids. And they're like, I don't care, Dad.
Yeah.
They'll get there. So if people aren't doing a worm farm at the moment, if they're not composting at the moment, and they don't have someone in their street like yourself to take their scraps, where do they start, and is the green bin at home a good option?
I think that's a really, really great question. And there are a couple of different sides to this argument. The first is that introducing food and organics collections is a great thing. We absolutely need to be reducing our food waste to landfill, and any way that we can do that is absolutely imperative to the future of the planet. Food scraps contribute up to 10% of global greenhouse emissions, and that is a really, really significant number. And the thing is that we within our households have control over reducing that figure. And for me, it is one of the ways that really assists with with my climate anxiety because it's one of the things, maybe the one thing that I have true control over. I can reduce my food waste to landfill in entirety. And so, that's a really, really wonderful thing about food organics collections, and it's an excellent thing for Australia to be bringing in. The flip side to that for me is that we will become complacent about the food that goes into our compost caddies. And first and foremost, if we are to reduce food waste, we actually need to be eating the food that we buy. And if we've got someone collecting that waste for us, I think there's a real risk that we can become quite complacent, that the food is being managed and it's not going to landfill. And so that reduces my guilt to zero. And so I can put as much as I want into my compost caddy. And actually, that's not the way that we should be thinking about this. We should be eating the food that we buy in the first instance, and then only composting the food that we can't eat.
Absolutely. I agree on that 100%. Do you know how the process works when it goes into a caddy? Is it being processed properly?
Yeah, I think for the most part it is. Okay. And my council isn't one of the councils that currently collects organic waste, so I don't have any details of the way they do it here, and I think council by council it's going to be slightly different. Mm-hmm. But I think for the most part it is done correctly, and what they do is they turn it into compost. But I think with commercial processes like this, there's a high degree of contamination. The end product isn't particularly high quality, so you've got a low value end product there, which is not going to be anywhere near the kind of product that you can create through a home composting system. Yeah. It's removing food waste from landfill, which is excellent, but the end product is not going to be particularly high value and probably has a fair bit of contamination.
We do have the green waste collection in our council, and there was a whole list of things we could put in, and then maybe 2 or 3 months later another list came out saying, can you stop putting this and this in, which made it very confusing for people. And I think that's not a great start for people trying to get into it. It's much easier to do it at home because you know exactly what's going in. But one thing they did say you need to stop putting in was animal waste, like animal poo. Is that something a worm farm can handle or not?
Yeah, it is. So I actually, as part of my community composting system, I have a dog poo collection point. Mm-hmm. And it is a separate bin dedicated to the community's dog poo. Right. And it actually collects a lot of dog poo in the community. It's gaining traction. Oh, good. That bin. So the worms will consume that. The issue is that you must keep it separate from your other composting units. So I have a dedicated system for my dog poo. Right. And the end product is absolutely beautiful. It is just as beautiful as the end products that I get from my food scraps. But you just can't really be certain that the worms will eliminate pathogens and any kind of little nasties. And so you have to be really mindful that end product only goes on ornamentals. Right. Absolutely don't put it anywhere near your edible garden. Yeah. But that said, absolutely go for it because it's a really, really great way to manage our pet waste in a really responsible way.
So if someone's listening to this and you've inspired them to do the same as what you're doing in the community and collect people's scraps and really try to reduce their waste, where on earth would you start?
So this is how I did it. I think I started it by capping it so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. So I started it only on the street and I sent flyers out to people who lived on the street, and I kept it quite contained so no one else could really understood that it was there. It wasn't a public system. People didn't see it as they drove past, and that way I could take baby steps into the process and wouldn't be immediately overwhelmed with a capacity that I couldn't handle. So I would say start small and start to understand your capacity and then build on it from there. So what I started out, I think, with 3 or 4 bathtubs, and I understood how much capacity that could take. Mm-hmm. And I knew that I had enough people participating that I could handle that amount of food scraps. And as time has gone on, I've opened it up further because I've understood what I am capable of as the one person who is managing the process. And I also understand a lot better how much my bathtubs can process over what period of time and the number of bathtubs I might need. And so I've opened it up. a lot more. Now it's open to the public, and, you can walk past my house and see that it's a compost hub, and anyone can leave whatever they like. But I think starting small is absolutely the way to go, and then building up as you learn and as you understand what your system can manage.
Have council had any pushback to this, that you're collecting people's scraps, or are they right behind you?
I decided not to tell them, so I've gone with a forgiveness rather than seeking permission kind of approach. But I think I've gained such a name now for myself and the garden, and people understand it and know about it, and kind of, uphold it as something that's really positive thing for the community, that I think it would be really difficult now for council to bite back.
Yes.
It's done such a great thing for community. It's built community, and it's really showcased and demonstrated what a small part of a community can achieve.
But it's amazing. I think if every community was to adopt something similar, the effect would be absolutely massive, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, it actually wouldn't take all that much, really. You need a champion. If you had a handful of champions in each suburb, where I live at least, you could probably eliminate a huge percentage of organic waste to landfill.
Amazing. So if people wanted to get in touch with you and ask you anything about the process and how you did it, how would they do that?
Well, you can contact me either through Instagram, and I am at the wormmonger, or you can also contact me via my website, which is thewormmonger.com. And, come at me with any kind of question or query, and there are no stupid questions when it comes to composting. Every question is a smart question. So, yeah.
I love it. I absolutely love it, Hannah. You're doing a fantastic job. Do you mind hanging around for a bit longer to answer some community questions?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So first question from Isabella in Melbourne. Hello, I love your passion for the compost, Charlie. Can I use compost in my indoor pot plants? I'm concerned about any possible smell or burning the plants. Absolutely, you can use this on your indoor plants. Do you agree, Hannah?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And when it comes to worm castings, it's pH neutral, so you can throw those on anything, and indoor plants, absolutely, go for gold.
But as you mentioned, the worm wee might be a little troublesome. You do want to dilute it.
Yeah, I would probably dilute that. I think probably 25-1, at least down until it's the colour of kind of a really pale, weak tea. And then, indoor plants are typically ornamental. So, there's no issue with putting that wee on those ornamental plants. I would absolutely do it in my own household.
Yeah, if you're using compost, you want to age that as well before you use it anywhere, even if it's an indoor plant. But worm castings, they're fine.
Yeah, that's right.
Ciara from Sydney. Hi, Charlie. My partner doesn't want a compost bin in our backyard because of the possible smell. I've tried educating him that this won't be a problem. Any advice for him to win this argument? What would you suggest to someone who's not interested in composting? Well,
I would say that healthy compost shouldn't smell. And so there is a process of learning. If you're a new composter, failing is a big part of the process for me. It's a great way to learn, just to get in there and get your hands dirty. And maybe at the beginning of that process, that learning journey, you might get a bit of a smell. And once that's a great way to learn, and you'll learn what not to do very quickly once you get a smell. Yep. And so the answer to smells for me is always carbon, add carbon, add carbon, add carbon. And I would say if you've got a husband or a partner who's slightly off put by smells, go carbon heavy from the outset, and hopefully you'll never get that smell situation going on.
It might take a little longer to process the compost if it's higher in carbon, but it's a good way to start out. Once your husband knows it's not going to smell, then you can start experimenting with a bit more nitrogen in there, and then he'll be hooked on the process.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Final question from Gus in Brisbane. Love the series, Charlie. My veggie beds haven't been as productive the last season or two. I do try to rotate the crops and look after the soil. Do you have any tips on how I can make sure the next season gives me a great crop? Well, worm castings would be a great way to do this, not just for the nutrient content, but because of all the tiny little bugs in there and all that sort of wonderful stuff for the soil.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's all about regenerating your soil. So, building that soil up and replenishing it with all the nutrients that the previous season has sucked out of that soil. Soil health is just absolutely key to everything. And that, involves healthy, high quality, premium compost.
Absolutely. I think also perhaps leaving it fallow for a season and maybe trying to improve it with some green manure crops would be a good thing to do. So put some green manure seeds down and just dig them back through the soil. You can even chuck a tin of lentils on there if you really wanted to and let them sprout. And then you don't cut them down, you just dig them through and leave that to kind of rot down itself. And that should do some wonders.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. A reminder, you can send through your questions at any time. Just email me at charlie@stihl.com.au. Hannah, it has been an absolute pleasure. I hope a lot of people get in contact with you and that you inspire the whole of the nation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
On the next episode of That's How We Grow, I'm going to be joined by a contemporary Aboriginal artist and AFL legend, Gavin Wanganeen. After winning 2 AFL premierships, a Brownlow medal, and joining the AFL Hall of Fame, Gavin found solace in his art.
I'm looking down through the stars, through the Milky Way, and through to the country, to the ground.
Painting artworks that speak to his Aboriginal heritage, Gavin and I are going to be discussing how the Australian landscape and Indigenous art intertwine.
Listener.
Thanks for joining me on That's How We Grow, and thanks to STIHL for powering it all along. Remember, STIHL's battery-powered outdoor equipment is powerful, lightweight, quiet, and it gives you the power and performance you need to take care of some serious work in your garden. And with over 600 dealers across Australia, there's going to be one near you. Check out the full range and find your nearest dealer now at stihl.com.au.